Hans Niemann opens up this 2026 Grand Chess Tour Blitz matchup in Poland against Jan Krzysztof Duda with e4. e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and we have the Italian game. Now, Duda has a couple of main paths here. He could go for the classical bishop c5, or maybe spice things up with the two knights defense by playing knight f6. He decides on bishop c5, entering the Giuoco piano variation. So Niemann has to pick his poison for the next move. He can immediately castle short, prep a big center with c3, or just keep it super solid with d3. Niemann opts for d3, which is a setup we literally call the Giuoco pianissimo, the very quiet game. Black's development is pretty straightforward from here. Usually, you'll see something like d6 to solidify the center, or knight f6 to get ready to castle. Duda plays d6, locking down that pawn structure. White has a lot of flexible waiting moves in this position. Common ideas for the next move are castling, or playing c3 to give that beautiful Italian bishop a safe retreat square on c2. And c3 it is. Very standard theory, just keeping things flexible. Black retreats the dark squared bishop to b6, keeping it on a very active diagonal. White castles the king to safety. And with that, we transition right into the middle game. The queen comes out to f6. This puts some early pressure on the center. White develops the bishop to e3, challenging that strong piece on b6. Knight e7, knight d2. Black pushes the pawn to h6, a useful little prophylactic move to control the g5 square. Pawn to b4. I really like this. Grabbing space on the queen side shows a clear plan to stretch the opponent. Black responds with a massive pawn push to g5. Taking 35 seconds here shows they are plotting something aggressive on the king side. White ignores it and just pushes the pawn to a4, looking to trap the bishop. Black marches forward with the pawn to g4, attacking the knight, looking to just capture it on the next turn. Knight to e1. White smartly steps out of the way, stopping that direct capture on f3. Knight d8. White continues the queenside expansion, pushing the pawn to a5 and directly attacking the bishop, threatening to just gobble it up. Black decides to trade the bishop on e3, which neatly sidesteps the threat to capture the bishop. This completely changes the pawn structure in the middle of the board. White recaptures with the pawn from the f-file, bringing a pawn towards the center, but creating a potential target. You can see the e3 pawn is left totally loose. This opens the f-file and sets up a threat to swing the rook to f6. The queen steps up to g5, immediately attacking that newly created weakness on e3, and putting a stop to any rook lifts to f6. White's queen comes up to e2 to defend the pawn. Black pushes the pawn to h5. The intention is super clear here. They want to storm the white king. White strikes in the center with pawn to d4! This is the classic textbook response to a flank attack, creating tension right in the middle of the board to distract the opponent. It forces Black to make some tough decisions. Black keeps pushing on the flank to h4. The tension is reaching a boiling point. Knight d3, Black decides to castle kingside. It is funny because they have pushed all the pawns in front of their king, but sometimes you just have to tuck the king away. Look at this pawn skeleton right here. It literally tells the whole story of the game. See that? White has these incredibly clunky doubled pawns on the e-file, specifically the pawn on e4, and the backward pawn on e3. This structural damage completely restricts White's flexibility in the center and creates permanent targets. Black should just patiently blockade this formation and chip away at those weaknesses. Always remember, shattered pawns like this are a massive liability that will haunt you into the endgame. Bishop b3, the king steps into the corner to g7, trying to find a safer haven behind the pawns. White captures the pawn on e5, opening things up and directly threatening to grab the pawn on d6. Black recaptures the pawn, dealing with that threat on d6. White brings the rook to the center on d1, knight g6. White pushes the pawn to b5. Hans took almost 2.5 minutes on this, leaving himself with just 58 seconds on the clock. It is fascinating how top players invest so much time to find the critical breakthrough. Black slides the queen back to e7. Duda also thought for over 2 minutes here, so both players are under massive time pressure now. White swings the rook up to f5. What a fantastic, annoying square for that piece, just staring down the black position. Black pushes the pawn to g3, trying to pry open the white king's defenses. White brings the other rook to f1. Black pushes the pawn to c6, challenging white's space. The queen slides over to h5, eyeing the king side. Black plays pawn to f6 to blunt the attack, setting up an idea to swing the queen over to c7. White simply takes the pawn on g3. Now wait, you might be wondering, why didn't white just take the pawn on c6 here? Well, if they had actually taken it, Black would simply capture the pawn on h2 with a brutal check. So yeah, that's exactly why they had to completely ignore the temptation. Black takes back, and now that h-file is wide open and looking very dangerous. They are even threatening to hop the knight into e6. White lifts the rook to f3, preparing to swing it over. This sets up a devastating plan to capture on g3 to completely bust the position open. Knight to e6. Black invested almost 30 seconds here, but unfortunately, they still completely mess up the defense. It is so tough to calculate correctly when the clock is ticking down. This move quietly prepares to challenge the file with the rook. But at this point, I think it would have been better to just play that right away and slide the rook to h8. White captures the pawn on g3 with the rook. Because of that previous mistake, the black king is completely exposed now, and this is totally winning for white. It completely crushes black's idea to bring the rook to h8, and sets up a direct mate in 2, starting with a capture on g6. Knight to g5. At this point, I think it would have been better to retreat the queen to e8. This knight move desperately tries to block the g-file and prevents the immediate checkmate. White takes the knight on g5. This captures a key defender and offers the exchange of a rook for a minor piece. The engine actually considers this a blunder. At this point, I think it would have been better to take with the f5 rook, but practically speaking, it keeps black under immense, unbearable fire, setting up an unstoppable mate in 1. Black accepts the trade and recaptures. This stops the immediate checkmate, but allows black to capture the rook. Let's look at a better variation. Black could have played, the bishop could take on f5, then the pawn would take on f5, and the pawn would take on g5. Black, this would look much better. Okay, now let's get back to the game. White takes the pawn with the rook. The pressure on the g-file is totally crushing, and it prevents black from simply taking the rook. Black moves the rook to f6, desperately trying to hold the position together. This sets up a quiet idea to develop the bishop to e6. Knight takes the pawn on e5, adding another attacker to the pinned pieces. This sets up a forced mate in 3, starting with a capture on g6. The queen drops back to e8, dodging that immediate mate threat. White plays the bishop to f7, poking at the queen. The queen retreats to the corner on h8. This creates a sneaky sequence threatening to take the queen on h5. White takes the knight on g6 with a brutal check. This completely ignores and stops black's threat to grab the queen. Black has to take back with the rook. The queen swoops in to take the rook with another check. The king tries to run to f8. White delivers another check with the queen on d6. The king is forced back to g7. The queen slides to e7, tightening the net. Black plays the bishop to h3. A final desperate attempt to create some chaos on the board. At this point, I think it would have been better to step the king to h6, but it's completely lost anyway. White checks with the bishop on e8, and this actually ends the game. The black king has absolutely nowhere to hide from the incoming checkmate. It is a spectacular and forced finish to a brilliant attack. What a spectacular attacking masterclass. I think this game perfectly highlights how dangerous flank attacks can be, and why meeting them with central strikes is so important. Defense is often much harder to play than offense, especially when the position gets this complicated. Let me know what your favorite moment was in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more chess recaps.